This is the book. It's about Sikkim. To me, it's a very fascinating book to read, which I did over the last week, and I'd like to, for about half this session, explore with Andrew the genesis of the book, the essence of the book, and then for the second half we'll take questions and comments. And I do note that my friend and former colleague at the UN, Shashi Tharoor, now a member of the Indian Parliament, is sitting in the front row. I have told him over breakfast that unfortunately I would not be able to catch his eye during the questions and comments session, but he has made it extremely difficult for me to do that without discourtesy, and this is, after all, above all, a very courteous kind of festival. Now, Andrew, I was struck first of all by the quality of serendipity about the way in which this book emerged, with your grandfather trekking around the region, your parents friendly with these two old spinster ladies who had taught at the key school in Sikkim. You're bumping into, on I think pretty well your first night in Sikkim, into a monk who had been sort of bodyguard and head of security for the late ruler. Would you like to tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, I mean, serendipity is right. I think sometimes if you put your antenna up, then you can, if you concentrate on a small area, then information kind of comes to you to a certain extent. I mean, I started getting interested in Sikkim through some photographs and notes that my grandfather had left from a trek that he'd done in 1922. And he had only been 24 at the time. I ended up doing it when I was, I think, 36. And that was a walk from Darjeeling into the lower foothills of Sikkim. And when I got to the apex of that walk, I met a monk who started to tell me some of the story of Sikkim, and I became interested in what had happened in Sikkim. And when I got back to the UK, you're absolutely right, it was serendipity in the sense that there were two Scottish missionary teachers who worked in Sikkim between 1959 and 1996 in total. The first one was there for 7 years, from 1959 to 1966, and the second one was there for a full 30-year missionary term. And when I went to visit them, they said, well, you know, I've wrote letters home to my mother every week. They're up in the attic, I'm sure you wouldn't be interested. And of course I said, well, bring them on down. And the second one said exactly the same thing. So what I realized was that this gave me a sort of contemporaneous account with no bias, no kind of feeling of wanting to project a message. There were letters home to their mothers, recording what they had seen in Sikkim. And Sikkim is, by the way, an absolutely tiny place. It's about a third the size of Wales, perched between Nepal and Bhutan. So if you're running the school, your headmistress of the girls' school in Sikkim, then you know pretty much everyone. And actually, they were pretty intimate with the royal couple, who were the crown prince at the time, and then he became the ruler, the Chogyal, and his American wife, Hope Cook, who went out and married in 1963. So that gave me that perspective as well. And I suppose the other serendipitous thing was that WikiLeaks released a whole bunch of cables in 2013, which were the cables between 1973 and 1976 between Kissinger and his ambassadors in New Delhi and in Beijing. And the ambassadors in New Delhi and Beijing at the time were actually quite good, pretty amazing characters, and they were able to write in a very entertaining way. And I put in a search for the word Sikkim, and up came 1,500 pages of cables, which made me realize that actually the story of Sikkim had been far more on the desks of international diplomats than perhaps people had thought before. So yes, absolutely, serendipity is a good word, I think.
I think I was also struck by some of the dialogue that you quote verbatim from meetings between Kissinger and the Chinese leadership. I mean, a very sort of pungent language, and rather jokey and rather irresponsible language on both sides.
You know, I mean, it was extraordinary coming across that, because to think that the Chinese leader and Henry Kissinger are talking about this American woman who's married a king of a place a third the size of Wales, it seemed incongruous to say the least. And I think Kissinger was saying that he thought she played with her prayer beads all the time. He says, I can't stand that woman, she plays with her prayer beads all the time. And that seemed to me such a kind of intimate comment from two leaders that opened up a whole new area.
It did puncture a bit my rather romantic idea of Hope Cook, because I was a young man when the two got married, and here you had in effect presented in the Western media the Princess Grace of the Himalayas, and in your book she comes out, she's on antidepressants a lot, she's having an affair with somebody in New York.
Yeah.
The marriage breaks up after 10 years and she never goes back to Sikkim. I think a lot of that didn't for some reason appear in the Daily Mail of the period.
Yeah, I contacted Hope Cook when I first started writing the book to try and talk to her about it, and she was of the opinion that she really didn't want to talk about Sikkim anymore because she'd written an autobiography in 1981. And I suppose the other main source, if you like, for Sikkim is a book written by a guy called Sunanda Datta Ray, who's a journalist in India, and he was pretty friendly with the king. So his perspective was I mean, it's an extraordinary book, Sunanda Datta Ray's book. It's called Smash and Grab. But I felt that what I was able to do by looking at the autobiography alongside this Sunanda Datta Ray book was try and understand a bit more about Hope Cook's character. And I did a lot of interviews with people in Sikkim who are all, by the way, coming towards the end of their lives. And there's something very interesting about that, because I think when people come towards the end of their lives, they're more willing to talk about events that they might not have talked about before. And I very much found that with people both in Sikkim and in Delhi. So that I was able to sort of really try and get underneath the skin of Hope Cook as a character. And I mean, I think it's only fair to say that her husband also was
I was going to come to him.
Was not behaving in perhaps quite the best way.
Well, alcoholic. I think in your book you suggest that there were illegitimate children before he got married, and that she seemed to be constantly worried about, jealous that there might be other ladies in his life. Of course, that's personal, but I think you also make pretty clear that in terms of the relationship with India, he made quite a series of quite serious mistakes over the years in his approach. Would you like to say where you think he got it wrong?
Well, that's a very interesting question, because the whole story of Sikkim is a bit of a tragedy, really, in some ways, because when Tondop Namgyal was 18, he was actually second son, and his elder brother was killed fighting in the Second World War, and so suddenly he was thrust into this position as Chogyam, and he'd actually been slightly bullied by his elder brother, so he'd been trained as a monk. And he suddenly became responsible for this kingdom, and he had to really take on that responsibility at an early age. And everything kind of hinged around this 1947, when the British withdrew from India, or India gained its independence. And at that stage, one of the big issues was the princely states, and how the princely states were going to be, how the issue of the princely states were going to be resolved. Because under British India, it was not all directly administered. There were 600 of these princely states, and Sikkim was one of the tiniest, but also never had a defined relationship with the British Empire. It was actually, the only definition was really in 1893, when the British in India and the Chinese, actually represented also by a British man, bizarrely, met, and they acknowledged the British acknowledged that China had a role in Tibet, and the Chinese acknowledged that Britain had a role in Sikkim. But that's the only thing other than that before 1947. So this Tondop tried to, he was very much of the opinion that Sikkim should have a semi-independent status, if you like, after 1947. And Nehru, who was the Indian Prime Minister, or the Indian leader at that stage, he was very passionate about the Himalayas and agreed to this status for both Sikkim and Bhutan. So there was nothing wrong with that. But then I think after 1959, when the Dalai Lama fled from Tibet, and there was really this change in the relationship between India and China, because China was now fully, unequivocally in Tibet. When that happened, Tondip also met Hope Cook around this time, and he tried to just assert his country's semi-independent status a bit more. And at the same time, India was getting greatly concerned about this tiny semi-independent state on its northern border. So there was, whether he and his wife, Hope Cook, there are some lovely little vignettes of the sort of things that they would do to aggravate the Indians. Hope Cook sent a whole bunch of mules onto the lawn of the Indian representative in Sikkim's capital, Gangtok, which seems, childish in the extreme. But that was the kind of thing that was going on. But also, they were not, under the treaty that they had, they were not responsible for foreign relations. So India was responsible for Sikkim's foreign relations. And that was really a critical piece, because once Tondip married this American woman, Hope Cook, one of the things he felt that this allowed him to do was to go out and talk about Sikkim in the world. And the Indian government felt that this was, this was just not on. It wasn't in accordance with the treaty. That caused problems as well. And then towards the end, it really did get quite difficult.
We'll get to that. I wanted to mention first, so you have a wonderful pair of what you might call stage villains in the shape of the Kazi and the Kazini.
Yes.
The Kazini being British lady who evidently hated the Chogyal, and maybe Mrs. Chogyal as well. Would you like to tell us a bit about them and their role? Because they also, when they got what they wanted, they realised it wasn't really what they wanted.
Yeah. So an important piece of context for the Sikkim story is the fact that the British had encouraged mass Nepali immigration, partially because they felt that the Nepalis were harder workers, and partly to negate the Buddhist influence in Sikkim. So by 1947, there were actually 75% Nepali population within Sikkim, Nepali born, or Nepali heritage, if you like. So the Buddhist king, if you like, had automatically his authority was somewhat diminished, and obviously the Nepali community, the Kazi was also actually from an ethnic Sikkimese, but he led the Nepali community really. He identified that this was the way to drive towards democracy, was to lead the Nepali community to 75%, within a context of an absolute monarchy, but the absolute monarch, the Chogyal, was willing to give some authority to democratic politicians. But the Kazi was impatient, unsurprisingly, to see that move on, and the Chogyal was reticent in terms of giving that power away. And in that respect, in 1959, he met this woman who, until recently, everyone thought was Belgian. And it transpires that partially because her granddaughter, who lives in Edinburgh, has done extensive research on her. She's actually the daughter of a colour sergeant in the Black Watch.
She's not here today.
She's not, no, I don't think. I have emailed her, but we have emailed, but anyway, she was the daughter of a colour sergeant in the Black Watch, and she had an extraordinary life actually, which ended up with her marrying this leading politician in Sikkim, who was also an aristocrat in Sikkim. And between them, she really was, quite poisonous in some ways. She was very good at writing difficult articles to cause trouble for the king and his American wife, who there were rumours that she felt she'd been passed over by the king before she got married to the Kazi. And so pantomime villain is right, and I had to kind of check myself at times to think, is it really this kind of yin and yang? But everyone that I spoke to said that was the case, that she was really very effective at creating opposition to the king and causing trouble. And the Kazi was just determined to see the end of absolute rule. And the real question was, if absolute rule ended, what was going to happen to the monarchy, to the monarchy within Sikkim? And I certainly ended up, after researching this book, feeling that if things had been played slightly different, then that monarchy might have sustained for a little longer than 1975. But essentially, he wasn't really willing to part with much power to the democratic politicians. And India, in some ways, played on that. The Indian Indira Gandhi, it would be fairer to say, rather than Indira Gandhi, who was the prime minister. She basically annexed the kingdom, or the last stage of the annexation, only 6 weeks before declaring a state of emergency across India, which took place just over 40 years ago, which I'm sure you're aware of.
Well, let's move on, if you like, from the personal to the institutional.
Yeah.
Because you talked about the annexation. Even with Shashi in the front row, I think I could say that from the book, India doesn't come out, or the India of Indira Gandhi doesn't come out very well. Manipulating the situation ruthlessly, staging a military takeover, cutting off the funds for the king, refusing him permission to travel, and so on. And I got the impression from your book very strongly that even those who were opposed to the Chogyal came to regret what had happened, because it changed fundamentally the rather unique and peculiar nature of this little Shangri-La.
Yes, I mean the referendum that was held in 1975, looking at both the UK Foreign Office records, which are now available under the 30-year rule, and the WikiLeaks released American records, you get an understanding of just how this, and talking to people on the ground in Sikkim, you get an understanding of just how manipulated that referendum was. And Indian politicians were being completely open about it with US diplomats. And in fact, the Indian Prime Minister who took over in 1977, partially for political reasons, but he actually said, this was wrong what we did in Sikkim, but we cannot reverse it. So that sense of skullduggery, if you like, as part of the referendum is impossible to dispute, really. There's an article, quite an interesting article recently in an online magazine called The Diplomat, talking about the similarities between the situation in Crimea and the situation in Sikkim, which I think is a bit of a stretch, but there is an interesting sense in which the world almost turns its back on these issues, which have a very complex historical background. Once they're resolved, it's like, well, we can't really do anything about it. And I think that was very much the same in Sikkim, that the world's politicians really said, well, if it's done, if you like. But yes, in India and Indira Gandhi's India, I think it is much fairer to say, do not come out very well out of the whole Sikkim story. And what I felt very passionate about being in Sikkim was that there were an awful lot of people in Sikkim who were saying, we need this story to be told, because they didn't really understand the story, actually, in many ways. I mean, Sananda Dattaray's book was popular, but in some ways it wasn't quite so accessible, because it was very... Sananda Dattaray did a fantastic job of talking about all the people within Sikkim. So there's names which really it's very, very hard to keep your head around unless you are from the local area. I mean, it's like writing about local politics and bringing in all these names and stuff. So I felt what I wanted to do was to understand that perspective, but put it into its context of this big geopolitical change in 1971, which might be worth just talking about briefly.
You want to?
Yeah. I mean, 1971 was really a critical year in Asia for a couple of reasons. One was that Kissinger made his rapprochement to the Chinese, and that really shifted things, partially because that then meant that the PRC, the People's Republic of China, took the seat in the UN that had been held by Taiwan until 1971. In response, Indira Gandhi signed something called the Indo-Soviet Treaty. So she said, well, if the Americans are going towards the Chinese, then there was always quite a pretty good relationship with the Soviet Union. She signed this Indo-Soviet Treaty, it's a friendship treaty. And then also in 1971, the critical thing in this particular area was the Bangladesh Liberation War. So where Pakistan, which had been these two arms on either side of India, the eastern arm was lopped off essentially with Indian support to a certain extent. So that changed.
Becoming Bangladesh.
Becoming Bangladesh, yes. So what is now Bangladesh was East Pakistan. So those events really kind of shifted the perspective on Sikkim from Indira Gandhi's point of view, because she now felt that she was very suspicious of the relationship between the Chinese and the Americans. Bangladesh was liberated, but if you look on the map, there's this tiny corridor of land that links what's called the northeast states of India with the main body of India, and underneath that is Bangladesh. And Sikkim, only in 1965, the Chinese had put troops in unknown quantities. It's probably actually only about 5,000 to 10,000, but some estimates are up to 50,000 troops into something called the Chumbi Valley, which is this valley which separates Sikkim and Bhutan. So all these things kind of came together to really heighten the geopolitical sensitivity of Sikkim at a time when Hope Cook and the Chogyal were, running a fashion show in New York. I mean, this is so there was a real sense in which this
artisan goods, was it?
What was it? Isotoner leotards, I think, was what she. But she was trying to, to give her credit. This woman is not all. She's very highly intelligent, still alive, highly intelligent, and she did a lot of good work in terms of trying to increase educational standards within Sikkim, and she did. Part of what she was trying to do with this fashion show was take Sikkimese handcrafts out to the world, but that wasn't how it was perceived in India, certainly not by Indira Gandhi. So these 71 is this very, very important year, and the annexation really took place in two parts, one in 73 and one in 75. And 73 was when the other interesting perspective on this whole situation is an intelligence perspective. So the Indian government had only really had an internal intelligence service for various reasons up until 1968, when an external intelligence service was set up called the Research and Analysis Wing, and they were very active in the period in the early 70s in North Bengal, where there were myriad problems in terms of you may have heard of the Naxalites, and there was the issue of Bangladesh itself.
They were kind of Maoists, weren't they?
They were Maoists, yeah. The Naxalites were Maoist terrorists and still are. And so the Research and Analysis Wing were pretty active, and they were used in 1973 to help encourage the opposition against the Chogyal, partially just to give him a nudge in the right direction would be how I think, certainly one Indian diplomat who I spoke to, that's how he described it. But I think without doubt it was a little bit more forceful than a nudge. So.
Well, lest we feel too censorious, I should say that you very fairly put at the very beginning of the book a quote from the acting British High Commissioner in Delhi, who says that essentially that had we still been running India, we would have dealt with a recalcitrant Maharaja sooner and more ruthlessly, but perhaps with less of a sort of tone of high moral superiority. So probably the outcome would not have been very different if it was still British India. Yeah. And then the decline of the Chogyal.
Yeah, I mean he had, as I said, he was thrust into this position at the age of 18. So he'd never expected to do it. And he did throw his life into trying to resolve the relationship between Sikkim and India. Now, his view on how it should be resolved was different from what the Indian government's view was. But there's no doubt that that's what he was trying to do. And maybe his methods were questionable, but he had a genuine belief that that's what he wanted to do. And it was very sad after 1975 because the Indian government did not treat him well. They kept him under virtual house arrest, and they sort of tracked him around when he went down to Calcutta. Hope Cook had left. She had left in 73, gone back to America. By the way, she'd given up her American citizenship when she went to Sikkim, and she got what's called a protected person's passport in India. But she didn't want to be Indian. So when in '75, when Sikkim was dissolved and the Sikkimese people became essentially Indians, she was left in a real quandary because she had to apply. She had to get a presidential order to get her citizenship back in America, which was an extraordinary story in itself. But the Chogyal really, he contracted cancer in the late '70s, and that was shortly after he'd lost his son. So there's a history of the eldest son within the Namgyal dynasty being killed.
Tell us what happened to the son.
Well, he was run off the road on his motorbike. So he was.
It wasn't a Mercedes.
No, so it wasn't a Mercedes. That's right. No,
hit by a lorry and went over a 300-foot.
Yeah, that's correct.
Drop.
And interestingly, I didn't hear anyone suggest that there was anything untoward about that death, which was a great surprise to me because I would have thought that is just the kind of thing which you'd think would be a conspiracy theory, but it wasn't really. And shortly after that, he contracted cancer, and he died in 1982 in a hospital in New York. And the Indian government actually paid for his body to be flown back to Sikkim, because by that stage, Sikkim now gets more money per head than any other state in it. Well, any other state apart from Goa. I think it's Goa and Sikkim are the two states that get more money per head than anywhere else in India. So there is a sense in which there's a continuing feeling that the Sikkim needs support from India, and probably quite rightly from an economic point of view. But yeah, so the Chogyal passed away in 1982. His second son was crowned in a very minor ceremony by a few people who were really trying to revive everything. But he has basically the second son who's still alive. He's been pretty much in meditation activities ever since. He's never really got involved in it. And there are other children who I've met on numerous occasions in Sikkim, but. There's no question that Sikkim is a settled part of India now, but I just felt that it was an important story to tell. It was a story that hadn't really been told in its completeness, and that's what I've tried to do.
I think it's time we moved on to questions, but I just wanted to say that I like the book because you have these large events happening, and you have very intimate events happening as well. And I quite like the idea of an absolute ruler with a palace with 5 bedrooms, and also a court life which includes frequent dinner parties with these 2 spinster ladies.
Yes.
Being invited. So it's it's Lilliputian in its well, what's the name of the small kingdom in its scale, and yet it also sweeps into Russia versus China, United States involvement, big powers, small powers, all not mixed up together because it's very clearly and well organised as a book, but it makes it fun because the intimate illustrates the large, and the large is made human by the intimate.
Yeah. Now, just one point on that. So the thing that really kind of probably turned everything for me in terms of the book was having these 2 missionary teachers who couldn't be more different. I mean, Martha Hamilton, who was the first missionary teacher out there, was from a very wealthy background, but deeply socialist, and she had a wonderful tone in terms of her. She was doing the twist with the king's sister Kukula, and with J.K. Galbraith, who was the U.S. ambassador at the time of the wedding.
He did his back in, didn't he?
He did his back in, yeah. And, so lovely, these lovely vignettes. And then the woman who took over from her was a woman called Ishbel Ritchie, who's sadly Martha Hamilton died in March, but Ishbel Ritchie's still alive, and she's 85 now. And Ishbel Ritchie couldn't have been more different. I mean, Martha Hamilton's writing, "Dear Mummy and Daddy," Ishbel Ritchie, "Dear Mother." So she's a much more sort of straightforward Scottish missionary, but also with a very brilliant eye. And she ended up having to write in Scots, broad Scots, to try and confuse the Indian censors, who she knew were letters. So it's wonderful.
Good. Now, has anyone read it? Would anyone like to comment on the issues? Shashi, didn't you indicate over breakfast that you might have a word or two to say to set this in its proper geostrategic
No, in fact, this was utterly fascinating, but I do want to make one brief clarification and ask a
By the
question.
way, can you hear Shashi at the back? You can. Good. Why don't you sort of
Stand, if you like.
stand and
Yeah.
shout?
Hi, I'm Shashi. Just to say, first of all, one small clarification, because this was utterly fascinating and seems to be eminently fair-minded. But your point about Bhutan and Sikkim being on the same plane isn't quite right.
Yes.
As you remember, in 1947, there were 3 Himalayan kingdoms whose future status was unclear, to put it mildly. Nepal ended up becoming fully independent.
Yes.
Bhutan became independent and a member of the United Nations later, but with a treaty that bound it to India and that obliged Bhutan to conduct its foreign relations in consultation with India. But Sikkim was only ever a protectorate. It never had independent status. There was no question of applying for membership of the UN. And as you know, when the British were ruling, they had this wonderful house on the hill, the Residence House, which is where Sikkim was really ruled from, and Chogyal was told what to do. So just to clarify that the 3 were slightly different, and that the takeover of Sikkim therefore doesn't quite resonate quite as dramatically as a similar action in Bhutan, let alone Nepal, would have done. The question I have for you is, hearing about all the materials you dug into, it sounds utterly fascinating. How did the Americans actually behave on all of this? Because I do remember there was an attempt made by Hope Cook to stir up some passions in America. She was in America at the time of the definitive takeover, and there was speeches and statements and some sort of attempt to rouse American public opinion and governmental action against the annexation by India. What do you find from your classified documents at the time as to how the Americans thought this through and why, in fact, they did nothing?
Yeah. So to deal with your clarification first, you're absolutely right. The difference between Sikkim and Bhutan in terms of the treaties that they negotiated, and we'll ignore Nepal because Nepal went fully independent, was that Bhutan's treaty was negotiated before the end of the Chinese Civil War and before the invasion of Tibet. So it was much harder, in fact, for Sikkim to negotiate the same kind of treaty, and therefore it got this protectorate state treaty. But essentially, you know, that protectorate state treaty has 2 parties to it. It has India and it has Sikkim. So in that sense, the argument that the Chogyal would always make is that gave Sikkim some sense of an independent personality. And certainly that was the intention in 1950 when that treaty was written. But you're absolutely right. I mean, Sikkim wasn't able to rely on the same kind of level. Actually, in terms of the UN, it's very interesting, 1971, because I found records of both the British and the Americans considering the question of whether Sikkim could have an application to the UN at the time when Bhutan, 1971 was a year when I think it was 5 countries were acceded to the UN, a number of Middle Eastern, I think some of the UAE countries and Bhutan, you know, why Sikkim wasn't able to do that was absolutely partially because of that treaty, which was less strong than anything else. But you know, that was thrown out the window in 1975. It's very clear, and the actions that were taken. As I've said, I mean, you know, it was in some ways it was kind of inevitable, but it wasn't done by international law, if you like.
It's all spelled out in your book.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, this is a condensed version you heard earlier, but Andrew does go into quite a lot of detail. And I got the impression from it that basically the Chogyal was trying to stretch the interpretation of the 1950 treaty beyond what it was realistic to hope for.
Yes, that's right.
And the fact
under
that
bad legal advice as well.
Yeah, under bad legal advice, British legal advice, of course, Shashi. The fact that his cousin was the king of Bhutan.
Yeah, yeah.
And if you like, the aspiration to do as well as his cousin, you know, do as well as the Joneses down the road. I thought one fascinating little paragraph in your book is about the fact that Hope Cook found herself on the same plane to New York as U Thant, and was able to speak to him, but she had taken some sort of tranquilizer or sleeping pill, and as a result, first of all, she was unable to express herself with any clarity, and secondly, and maybe even worse, he was unable to hear her. because she was notorious for speaking in a very low voice. But essentially, she turned herself into a zombie on the plane.
And you,
so,
you might wonder how I know that, because she wrote it in her autobiography. So these things, but the autobiography is quite hard to kind of get under, but I spent quite a lot of time doing that. To your second question, given that we're talking about Hope Cook, is a very important one as well. This was a period when America had a lot of things on its plate. The Vietnam War was coming to an end. The Watergate scandal had really kind of sort of beginning to peter out, but it was still live in early 1975. But they had an ambassador, and the ambassador changed around March 1975. They had an ambassador called Pat Moynihan. He's a very, very interesting character. He was a Democrat politician who then became Nixon put into his cabinet in order to I can't remember the exact role, but it was something about looking at the question of race relations. And then he was sent out to America, and he's a brilliant writer. And getting so you really get a sense of how he was trying to resolve this issue between Sikkim and India, or trying to push forward in such a way that it would get resolved. But in March 1975, Bill Saxby came in, and Bill Saxby was much more of a straight-talking, Cold Warrior kind of guy. And he actually had to come in to Delhi under the cover of darkness, because they were so worried about the anti-CIA demonstrations that would be taking place as he arrived. So they brought him in through the back door in March 1975. And a month later, the events happened in Sikkim. But I've seen no evidence that the Americans tried to encourage or they watched. I think it would be reasonable to say.
Bigger fish to fry.
They had much bigger fish to fry, and that's one of the tragic elements of the Sikkim story. It's interesting in terms of certainly in a bipolar world, which existed at that stage, pretty much bipolar. That there was really never a chance for Sikkim to survive in that respect. The context of the emergency in 1975, actually, I was really intrigued, and I continue to be poring over, actually, because there's an awful lot of records within the American WikiLeaks records, the WikiLeaks records that refer to the about the American attitude after the emergency. And that is interesting, and how America tried to, sort of manipulate things in the background after that. So that's interesting.
I must say, I read Moynihan's reporting with a strong sense of recognition from having been a head of mission myself, because one of his main complaints is that we do all this detailed reporting and analysis, we get it right, and we never get any reaction from
That's a brilliant
from headquarters until something else completely unconnected happens, and then they want to know, stuff that we've already told them, or they want to act on recommendations that we've already made, and that have been ignored until some congressman, raises an unconnected.
He finishes a long report with, "If anyone is still listening."
He was also a very, very good American ambassador to the UN. I mean, he was tremendously good at media presentation, and he was very good on substance. So, would anyone else like to comment or ask a question, Madam?
I've read the book, and I would recommend it to absolutely everybody. For me, it was a window on the world of my youth, and sort of various aspects were familiar to me, but the majority of it was new. The elephant in the room seemed to be Henry Kissinger, and you sort of opened the door to what might have been his role. And I understand that you were not able to interview him, but it would be wonderful to have his comment on your book at some point, if you could manage that.
There's a copy in the post.
You might have to pay him quite a lot.
He's a very hard man to track down. I did try and track him down, but yes, he's a hard man to track down. But I mean, he's a divisive character in some ways, and a fascinating character, and still fascinating, still heavily involved in the back rooms of everything, I think. So,
I had no idea that he had this rather negative relationship with Indira Gandhi.
Oh, yeah.
Yes, very negative relationship with Indira Gandhi.
Principle.
Yes. The words bitch and witch were used by both Kissinger and Nixon during the crisis in November 1971 during the Bangladesh War, and Indira Gandhi went over to New York to try and to Washington rather to try and resolve things, and Kissinger and Nixon just couldn't. They had no ability to have a relationship with this woman as well. Very different, of course, to Nixon's ability to have relationships with Pakistani, the Pakistani leader, which was much more kind of ebullient and sort of easy relationship. And you know, the fact is, Indira Gandhi was. I find it very interesting that the whole issue of her as a female politician in the world of male politicians. And I've become very interested in the relationship between Mrs. Thatcher and Mrs. Gandhi. Mrs. Thatcher was, in 1984, Mrs. Thatcher was, October 1984, Mrs. Thatcher was blown up by the IRA, obviously unsuccessfully. Only 3 weeks later, Indira Gandhi was shot dead by her Sikh bodyguards. And so there's this, and it was actually, I think that was a pretty important turning point for Mrs. Thatcher in terms of her sort of steeliness after that point. They developed a very close relationship, well, not very close relationship, but they developed a very good working relationship. And Mrs. Thatcher had been out in 1976. Mrs. Thatcher was one of the few politicians who went out to India and reportedly, though it's quite hard to track down the exact source for this, reportedly sat at the feet of Mrs. Gandhi and asked her how she did it.
Well, both of them, was it said, the only man in the cabinet, with some justice.
Yeah.
I was also struck from your book by Indira Gandhi's technique, which requires quite a lot of nerve,
Yeah.
of smiling enigmatically and saying nothing.
Crossing
When
her
you're-
arms.
Yeah, when you're asked a question you don't want to answer, you don't. I mean, what do our modern politicians do? They prevaricate, they dance around the subject, they accuse the other side of being wrong. She just apparently folded her arms, smiled enigmatically, and said nothing. And you know, there's a technique also, if someone doesn't answer you, of just leaving it, forcing them to speak. And you couldn't do that with Indira. She just carried on, smiling and still and held her silence.
Yeah.
Who else would like to, please?
Given all the information that you've seen through your research
Yeah.
and sort of tell you a lot more, what is the next book that you're thinking about? Is it a sequel to this?
You're not his agent, are you?
I'm working on a few ideas at the moment. In fact, one of the challenges with the Sikkim book was where to start. And I actually started it much earlier. There is, if anyone wants it, an 800-page version, which starts in pretty much 1815, so around the time of the Anglo-Gurkha War. It's quite complex history, but really runs through that whole period when Britain was using, Sikkim was really the base for the British, one of the bases for the British in terms of getting into Tibet and establishing a relationship with Tibet. It was through Sikkim and through the Chambi Valley that the Young Husband expedition in 1904 went in order to try and open up trade with Tibet. And it was Sikkim was the political officer in Sikkim was the political officer of Sikkim, Bhutan and Tibet. You know, that was his responsibilities. And you know, there's an extraordinary group of men during the early 1910s and 1920s, 1930s who were known as the frontier cadre, who were essentially responsible for that, trying to build that relationship with Tibet and create Tibet into some kind of buffer state, if you like, to protect the northern flank of British India. So that I find that very interesting, and I'm looking at certainly Mrs. Gandhi. I find a very, very I really felt like I just started to get to know her character through this book, and I'd be interested to explore that further. And then there's another story about smuggling Nazi art out of Soviet Russia, but that's
I think one of the many fascinating things about the book are the way in which it sets out the family relationships between the Chogyal and Tibetan aristocrats,
Yes.
and the marriage relations. And also what quite surprised me is stories about the Dalai Lama finishing his exams. I mean, the guy's already been recognized as a living Buddha, but he seems still to have to, do his PhD in Buddhist theology.
Well, of course,
and how rich he seemed to be, that he was giving many gifts of silver to the Chogyal.
Well, Sikkim was essentially a vassal of Tibet, if you like. So in that's one of the things that's difficult about that was difficult in 1947 about the relationship. So whereas a lot of the other princely states were more naturally part of a territory, if you like, the liminal parts there was a question as to what their role was, and certainly both Sikkim and Bhutan had probably just as strong relations with Tibet as they had with British India. So that's.
Now look, we've got about 1 minute left. I mean, literally 1 minute left. Is anyone burning to say anything? To ask anything? William Dalrymple is among us. Surely there's no comment. There's no comment on which William doesn't have a comment in this part of the world. No, not today. So you've answered every question, even from William Dalrymple. Oh, sorry, madam.
Would you ever write on Bhutan?
I've been asked to write on Bhutan. So there's people within Sikkim who think I should be writing on Bhutan next. I think it was quite a struggle to get underneath the information, underneath the story of Sikkim, and I think it might be equally difficult to get underneath the story of Bhutan, but never say never would be our answer.
Good. Well, that's a good note on which to end. They're very keen on punctuality at this festival, and I think I would be thrown out of my lodgings if I didn't wind it up now. But I'd like to thank Andrew for, I think, a really fascinating book. And I think he's going to be signing copies if people would like to buy copies.
I'll just say one other thing. I just put a bunch of videos on my website which really sort of bring this whole story to life. There's fantastic footage of Hope Cook and the Chogyal getting married. AndrewDuff.net. So there's a tab at the top which is Sikkim videos, and there's videos of the Chinese troop build-up in 1975 as well, and a fantastic video from 1971, which was Satyajit Ray, who's a great Indian filmmaker, made this film about Sikkim, which wasn't seen for 39 years, it was only released in 2010. But I put those all on my website. So
thank you all for coming, and have a look at the website.